Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the marble corridors of ancient Rome, where you can almost smell the incense burning in distant temples and hear the soft shuffle of sandaled feet against polished stone. You're standing in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, watching as oil lamps flicker to life across the city below. And somewhere in this sprawling empire of power and ambition, a senator is about to make a choice that will either destroy him or redefine what love means entirely. You probably wouldn't survive 5 minutes in this world of political backstabbing and casual brutality, but tonight you get to witness one of history's most dangerous gambles from the safety of your bed. If you enjoy strange, sleepy history like this, hit like and subscribe. It really does help me create more of these midnight journeys into the past. And hey, tell me your city and what time you're listening. I always check those comments and love seeing where you all are in the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan if you've got one, and let's slide into tonight's story about a man who had everything Rome could offer, except the one thing he wanted most. You find yourself drifting through the wealthy district of Rome in the year 58 BCE, where marble facades gleam like moonlight, and the air carries the scent of exotic spices from distant provinces. The streets here are wider than elsewhere in the city, paved with stones so perfectly fitted that even the wheels of the heaviest carts barely make a sound. This is where senators live, where the men who rule the known world retreat after long days of deciding the fates of millions. You pause outside one particular villa, its walls adorned with frescoes depicting mythological scenes that would make your art history professor weep with joy. Through the open courtyard, you can hear the gentle splash of water from ornate fountains, the kind of luxury that takes generations to build and moments to destroy. The owner of this house commands legions, owns vast estates across 3 provinces, and sits among the most powerful men in human history. Yet tonight, as you watch him pace those marble floors, you realise he looks more like a lovesick teenager than a master of the Roman world. Historians still argue whether what happened next was the result of genuine emotion or calculated political manoeuvring. But the letters that survive tell a story so raw and desperate that even 2,000 years later, they make you believe in the kind of love that burns down empires. You see, this isn't just another tale of Roman excess or political intrigue. This is the story of Senator Gaius Scribonius, a man whose name appears in official records as a model citizen, a decorated war veteran, and a shrewd political operator who understood the game better than most. What the official records don't mention is that Scribonius was also completely, recklessly, devastatingly in love with someone he legally owned. In a society where slaves were considered property, no different from furniture or livestock, where the very concept of consent between master and slave didn't exist, one man was about to challenge every assumption his civilization held sacred. You might think this sounds romantic, but remember, we're talking about a world where crucifixion was considered light entertainment, and where political enemies regularly ended up as fish food in the Tiber River. The evening breeze carries the sound of distant music from another villa, where some other senator is probably hosting a dinner party, filled with the usual mix of political scheming and culinary excess. But here in this house that should be filled with the confident bustle of servants preparing for another day of conquest and commerce, there's an unusual stillness. You can almost feel the tension hanging in the air like incense smoke, the kind of electric anticipation that precedes either celebration or catastrophe. As you settle deeper into this ancient evening, you begin to understand that you're not just witnessing a love story. You're about to see how one man's personal revolution nearly toppled the foundations of the Roman legal system, challenged the very concept of citizenship, and forced an empire to confront questions it had spent centuries avoiding. The marble grows cooler beneath your feet. The oil lamps flicker lower, and somewhere in the shadows of this villa, destiny is putting on its sandals and preparing to change the world. You drift deeper into the villa's shadows, where the real story begins not with love letters or stolen glances, but with something far more Roman, an obscene amount of money. The man you're about to meet, Senator Gaius Scribonius, belongs to a tier of wealth so stratospheric that modern billionaires would genuflect in his presence. You're looking at someone who owns entire cities the way you might own a coffee mug, and tonight you'll discover that all those riches mean absolutely nothing when your heart decides to betray everything your world stands for. The moonlight streams through the villa's open roof, illuminating rooms filled with treasures that would make museum curators faint. You see ivory from Africa carved into impossibly delicate figurines, silk from China that costs more per yard than most Romans earn in a year, and bronze statues so lifelike you half expect them to start gossiping about their neighbours. This isn't just wealth, this is the kind of generational fortune that reshapes continents and redefines what's possible for human ambition. Scribonius inherited his first fortune from his father, a man who had the good sense to invest in Egyptian grain futures during a particularly brutal famine. But the son proved even shrewder than his father, turning those initial millions into something approaching a small nation's treasury. You watch him move through rooms lined with chests full of gold coins, bearing the faces of dead emperors, each one worth more than entire villages, and you realise you're looking at someone who could literally buy his way out of any problem Rome might throw at him. Except, as you'll soon discover, the problem heading his way isn't the kind that responds to bribery. The senator's wealth comes from everywhere and nowhere, all at once, the way truly massive fortunes always do. He owns silver mines in Spain that employ thousands of workers who'll never see daylight, olive groves in Gaul that stretch beyond the horizon, and shipping fleets that carry everything from British wool to Indian spices across Mare Nostrum. Historians still argue whether his total worth exceeded that of entire provinces, but the account books that survived suggest he could have funded his own army and still had enough left over to throw a party that lasted until the next century. You find yourself in his private study, where maps of the known world cover tables made from woods that no longer exist. Here's where Scribonius plans his next investment, his next political move, his next expansion of an already incomprehensible empire of commerce. The scrolls scattered across his desk detail transactions that would make your head spin. 100,000 denarii for a single shipment of purple dye, enough to buy a small town. All because Romans with money have decided that only one specific shade of mollusk-derived colour can adequately express their superiority. But wealth in Rome isn't just about having money. It's about having the right kind of money, earned in the right way, spent on the right things. You see, Romans have turned financial snobbery into an art form that makes modern social media influencers look like amateurs. There's old money and new money, blood money and clean money, money that makes you respectable, and money that makes you dangerous. Scribonius has managed to accumulate all of these categories simultaneously, which should make him untouchable. Should being the operative phrase here. The irony that's about to unfold would be hilarious if it weren't so tragic. This man, who can buy senators like other people buy bread, who owns more slaves than some cities have citizens, who could literally purchase his own province if he felt like it, is about to discover that the one thing he wants most in the world is the one thing his money makes impossible to obtain honestly. You're watching a man who has spent his entire life believing that every problem has a price, about to encounter a situation where paying that price might cost him everything else he's ever worked for. The villa's silence feels heavier now, as if even the marble walls understand what's coming. You notice how the servants move differently here, with a careful deference that goes beyond mere training. These aren't just employees, they're investments, assets, property that happens to breathe and think and feel. In the morning, Scribonius will wake up and make decisions about human lives the way other people choose what to wear. Because in his world, that's not just normal. It's necessary for maintaining the kind of lifestyle that requires small armies of people to sustain. Tomorrow, all of this carefully constructed world of absolute power and infinite wealth will begin to crack. Because love, as you're about to discover, doesn't negotiate. It doesn't respect property laws or social hierarchies, or the careful balance of power that keeps empires running smoothly. Love just shows up, uninvited and unimpressed by your bank account, and starts making demands that no amount of gold can satisfy. You step closer to the reality that Romans preferred to keep hidden behind their magnificent marble facades. Slavery wasn't just an economic system, it was an entire universe of carefully crafted illusions, designed to make everyone feel better about owning other human beings. Tonight you'll see how Rome's wealthiest families turned human bondage into something that almost looked like luxury, and how one particular slave became so wrapped up in golden chains that even his master forgot they were chains at all. The household slaves in Scribonius's villa live better than most free Romans, which tells you everything you need to know about how twisted this system really is. You watch them glide through rooms wearing tunics of fine linen, their hair styled by professional beauticians, their meals prepared by chefs who could work in the finest restaurants. These aren't the mud-caked, whip-scarred figures your imagination conjures when you think of ancient slavery. These are people who've been polished and perfumed and educated until they shine like precious objects, which, legally speaking, is exactly what they are. The Romans perfected the art of making slavery look appealing, at least from the outside. You see, if your slaves are well-dressed and articulate and talented, it reflects better on your status as their owner. It's like having a luxury car that happens to be sentient and capable of composing poetry, or playing the lyre with supernatural skill. The better your human property looks, the more impressive your wealth appears to your neighbours. It's a system so fundamentally disturbing that even Romans occasionally felt the need to write philosophical treatises justifying it, which should tell you something about how well they slept at night. You drift through the villa's servant quarters, and the cognitive dissonance hits you like a slap. These rooms are nicer than apartments you've seen in major cities, complete with private sleeping areas, small personal shrines, and even windows that let in actual sunlight. The slaves here can read and write, often in multiple languages. They're trained in music, mathematics, literature, and arts that most free citizens never master. Some of them are more educated than their owners, which creates the kind of psychological tension that keeps entire civilizations awake at night, wondering if they're the good guys. Historians still argue whether this system was more humane than other forms of slavery, but they're missing the point entirely. You can't make owning people humane by giving them better food and softer beds. You can only make it more psychologically comfortable for the owners, which is exactly what Roman slavery was designed to do. It let wealthy families like Scribonius's sleep peacefully while surrounded by human beings who could be bought, sold, traded, or killed at their whim, regardless of how many silk tunics those human beings happened to be wearing. The economic mathematics of Roman slavery would make your head spin. A trained household slave could cost more than a villa in the countryside, especially if they possessed rare skills like medical knowledge or artistic talent. Some slaves were worth more than their master's annual income, which created the bizarre situation of people owning assets more valuable than themselves. It's like having a pet dragon that's also a certified financial advisor and concert pianist. Impressive, profitable, and absolutely insane when you stop to think about it for more than 30 seconds. You notice how the other slaves move around one particular figure in this household, and suddenly the evening's tension makes perfect sense. There's a deference here that goes beyond the usual hierarchy, a careful attention that suggests someone special lives among these gilded servants. The other slaves speak to this person with the kind of respect usually reserved for minor deities or visiting dignitaries, which in the twisted logic of Roman society makes perfect sense. Some slaves, you see, become so valuable and so integrated into their masters' lives that they occupy a social position higher than free citizens, even while remaining legal property. This is where Roman slavery reveals its most insidious trap. It could make bondage feel like privilege, oppression feel like opportunity, and ownership feel like protection. The system was so sophisticated that some slaves genuinely believed they were better off as valuable property than as free citizens struggling to survive in Rome's brutal economy. It's the kind of psychological manipulation that would make modern marketing executives weep with professional admiration. The moonlight catches something glittering in one of the servant rooms, and you realise you're looking at jewellery that would bankruptify most senators. These aren't the simple adornments of household staff. These are gifts, rewards, tokens of affection that blur the line between master and property until it becomes almost invisible. Almost, but never entirely. Because no matter how golden the chains, no matter how comfortable the cage, no matter how much genuine affection might develop between owner and owned, the fundamental relationship remains unchanged. One person can be sold, and the other person can do the selling. Tonight, in this villa where slavery wears a silk mask and speaks in educated whispers, you're about to witness what happens when that carefully maintained illusion finally shatters against something even more powerful than Roman law. A senator's heart that refuses to acknowledge the difference between loving someone and owning them. You follow the sound that's been threading through the villa's evening air like smoke through marble corridors, and suddenly you understand why Scribonius spends his nights pacing instead of sleeping. The voice you're hearing doesn't just carry music, it carries magic, the kind that makes grown senators forget they're supposed to be dignified and rational and completely in control of their emotions. Tonight you'll discover how one slave's extraordinary talent became the senator's beautiful catastrophe. The voice belongs to Lycaon, a young man whose name means wolf-born in Greek, though there's nothing predatory about the sounds flowing from his throat. You're listening to someone who can make a simple morning prayer sound like the gods themselves are harmonizing, who can turn a mundane recitation of household accounts into something that would make professional musicians quit their day jobs in despair. This isn't just singing. This is the kind of vocal artistry that makes people believe in divine intervention and question everything they thought they knew about human capability. Lycaon's voice has that rare quality that transcends technical skill and ventures into something approaching sorcery. You hear him practicing scales in what should be a routine vocal exercise, but somehow he's managed to turn simple note progressions into an emotional journey that leaves you feeling like you've just witnessed the birth of stars. Roman dinner guests have been known to stop mid-conversation when he performs, their wine forgotten, their political scheming temporarily abandoned, as if his voice has the power to pause time itself. The young man's musical education would have cost more than most Romans earn in a lifetime, because Scribonius spared no expense in developing this particular asset. You see Lycaon surrounded by instruments that most professional musicians only dream of touching, a lyre made from ivory and gold that supposedly once belonged to a famous Greek composer, flutes carved from rare woods that produce tones so pure they seem to bend the air around them, and percussion instruments crafted by artisans whose techniques died with the fall of ancient kingdoms. This is what happens when unlimited wealth meets genuine talent. You get something so extraordinary that it stops being entertainment and starts being art. Historians still argue whether Lycaon was originally trained as a musician or whether his gift was discovered accidentally, but the household records suggest his voice was recognised early and cultivated with the same intensity Romans usually reserved for military strategy. His daily routine includes hours of practice, sessions with voice teachers imported from Greece, and constant refinement of techniques that push human vocal ability to its absolute limits. He's not just a slave who can sing, he's been transformed into a living instrument, more valuable than most senators' entire estates. The cruel irony isn't lost on you as you watch this scene unfold. Lycaon's extraordinary gift has made him simultaneously the most valuable and most trapped person in the household. His voice has elevated him above the other slaves, given him privileges and comforts that most free Romans can't afford, and made him absolutely indispensable to his master's social standing. But that same talent has also made escape impossible, because where else in the world could someone with his abilities hide? He's too recognisable, too valuable, too uniquely gifted to simply disappear into the crowd. You notice how Scribonius listens from the shadows, his usual senatorial composure completely abandoned. This is a man who addresses the Roman Senate with casual confidence, who negotiates with foreign kings as equals, who can stare down angry mobs without flinching. But put him within earshot of Lycaon's voice, and he becomes something between a teenager with his first crush and a religious convert hearing divine truth for the first time. It would be amusing if it weren't so dangerous. The other household members have learned to recognise the signs. When Lycaon sings, Scribonius becomes completely useless for any practical purpose. Business meetings get forgotten, important correspondence goes unanswered, and political obligations are abandoned as the senator finds increasingly creative excuses to remain within earshot of that impossible voice. You're watching a man who built an empire through careful calculation and strategic thinking, reduced to a lovesick fool by something as simple and complex as perfectly executed music. What makes this even more fascinating is that Lycaon seems genuinely unaware of the effect he's having. You see him treating his musical performances as routine household duties, the way other slaves might approach cooking or cleaning. He's been trained to view his extraordinary gift as simply another service to provide, another way to contribute to the household's smooth operation. The idea that his voice could be driving his master to distraction, could be inspiring genuine emotional attachment rather than mere aesthetic appreciation, doesn't seem to have occurred to him at all. But voices like Lycaon's don't just entertain. They seduce, they entrance, they create emotional connections that transcend the normal boundaries between people. And in a society built on rigid hierarchies and carefully defined relationships, that kind of transcendence becomes dangerous very quickly. You're about to witness how beautiful music can become a weapon against social order. how artistic perfection can challenge political stability, and how one slave's gift can threaten to bring down everything his master has spent a lifetime building. You slip into the marble corridors where whispers travel faster than horses and secrets have a half-life shorter than morning dew. The Roman Forum isn't just the political heart of the empire, it's the gossip capital of the ancient world. And tonight you'll discover how quickly salacious rumours can transform from idle chatter into weapons capable of destroying even the most powerful senators. The whispers about Scribonius and his remarkably gifted slave have begun to take on a life of their own. The first murmurs started innocuously enough, the way these things always do. You hear them floating through dinner parties and bathhouse conversations. Have you heard Scribonius's new singer? Absolutely divine. But Roman society has a peculiar talent for reading between lines that don't even exist yet. And it didn't take long for innocent appreciation of musical talent to morph into something far more scandalous. Within weeks, the whispers had evolved into full-blown speculation about what exactly happens behind the senator's villa walls after the evening's entertainment concludes. Roman gossip operates on principles that would make modern tabloid journalists weep with professional envy. You see, in a society where reputation literally determines your survival, the ability to destroy someone with carefully placed rumours becomes a form of currency more valuable than gold. The wealthy and powerful spend enormous amounts of time and money cultivating their public image, which makes them exquisitely vulnerable to exactly the kind of talk that's currently swirling around Scribonius like vultures around fresh carrion. The bathhouses are where the real damage gets done, because Romans have turned public nudity into a networking opportunity that puts modern business lunches to shame. You float through the steam-filled chambers where senators and merchants and foreign dignitaries gather to conduct business while soaking in waters, heated by elaborate underground furnaces. Here, with their clothes safely stored in lockers and their usual social armour temporarily abandoned, Rome's elite engage in the kind of unguarded conversation that shapes empires and destroys careers. I heard he bought the boy specifically for his vocal talents, someone mentions, with the kind of meaningful pause that carries more weight than entire speeches. The comment gets passed along from bath to bath, gathering embellishments and implications like a snowball rolling downhill. By the time it reaches the forum's political circles, the innocent observation about musical ability has transformed into a full scandal, involving everything from corruption to religious blasphemy. Historians still argue whether these early rumours contained any actual truth, or whether they were simply the product of Roman society's obsession with finding sexual scandal in every situation. But the damage was already being done, regardless of their accuracy. You see, in Roman politics, the truth matters far less than what people are willing to believe, and Romans are always willing to believe the worst about their leaders. It's like democracy's built-in self-destruct mechanism, designed to ensure that anyone who rises too high will eventually get pulled back down to earth. The most dangerous whispers aren't coming from Scribonius's enemies. They're coming from his friends. You listen to conversations between senators who genuinely respect him, who fought alongside him in political battles, and consider him a valuable ally. But even friendly concern can sound like condemnation when filtered through Rome's gossip networks. I'm worried about Gaius becomes, have you noticed how strange Gaius has been acting lately? Which becomes, something very odd is happening in the Scribonius household. The servants' gossip network operates on entirely different principles, but proves even more effective at spreading information. You realise that Rome's slave population constitutes the most efficient intelligence system in human history, because servants see everything, hear everything, and have extensive social connections that cross household boundaries like ancient internet connections. When Scribonius's kitchen staff mentions their master's unusual behaviour to friends working in other villas, the information spreads through Rome's elite households faster than a plague. What makes these whispers particularly dangerous is their grain of truth wrapped in layers of speculation. Yes, Scribonius does spend unusual amounts of time listening to his slaves' musical performances. Yes, he has been neglecting some of his political obligations. Yes, there's something different about the way he interacts with this particular member of his household. But by the time these observations get filtered through multiple layers of Roman gossip, they've transformed into a scandal that threatens to consume everything the senator has worked to build. You watch as the rumours begin affecting Scribonius's daily life, in subtle but measurable ways. Dinner invitations become less frequent. Political allies start maintaining careful distance. Business partners begin hedging their bets and quietly exploring alternative arrangements. The whispers haven't yet coalesced into formal accusations, but they're creating an atmosphere of suspicion that makes everyone nervous about their association with a senator who might be losing his grip on Roman propriety. The cruelest irony is that the whispers contain just enough truth to be believable and just enough fiction to be devastating. You're watching how public perception can become its own reality, how rumours can create the very scandal they claim to describe, and how a society built on reputation can destroy people for crimes they haven't actually committed yet. The marble columns of the Forum have heard these whispers before, and they know how this story usually ends. You witness the precise moment when rational political calculation collides with irrational human emotion, and the resulting explosion is spectacular enough to be seen from the outer provinces. Tonight you'll watch a man who has spent decades mastering the intricate game of Roman politics suddenly decide that winning isn't worth playing anymore, and discover why senators who fall in love might as well be committing suicide in slow motion. The transformation in Scribonius becomes visible in ways that make his fellow senators physically uncomfortable to watch. You see him during a crucial vote about grain subsidies, a topic that normally would have him crafting brilliant speeches and building careful coalitions, but instead he's staring off into space with the dreamy expression of someone mentally composing love poetry. His colleagues exchange glances that mix concern with the kind of professional embarrassment you feel when watching a respected colleague have a very public nervous breakdown. Roman politics requires a specific type of personality, calculating, pragmatic, emotionally controlled, and utterly devoted to the long-term accumulation of power and influence. You're watching what happens when someone with that exact personality suddenly discovers they care more about something else than their own political survival, and the cognitive dissonance is so severe it's actually painful to observe. It's like watching a master chess player suddenly decide to use their pieces to build tiny sculptures instead of winning the game. The Senate sessions, where Scribonius was once a dominant force, now feature him as a distracted observer who occasionally asks questions that have absolutely nothing to do with the topic at hand. During a heated debate about military funding, he stands up and inquires whether anyone knows the origin of a particular musical scale. His fellow senators stare at him like he's just announced his intention to become a professional juggler or convert to some exotic foreign religion that requires ritual dancing. Historians still argue whether this behaviour represents genuine emotional overwhelm or a calculated political strategy so sophisticated that nobody else understood it. But the evidence suggests Scribonius had simply reached the point where he no longer cared about maintaining his carefully constructed public persona. You're watching a man who has spent his entire adult life pretending to be someone he isn't, suddenly deciding that the pretense costs more than it's worth. The political implications of this transformation ripple outward like stones thrown into still water. Scribonius's voting patterns become erratic and unpredictable, which terrifies his allies and confuses his enemies. Long-term legislative strategies that depended on his support suddenly become uncertain. Coalition partnerships that took years to build start showing stress fractures because nobody can rely on a senator who might be too busy thinking about music to remember which side he's supposed to be on. You notice how his speeches change, becoming more passionate and less strategic. Where once he spoke in the carefully measured cadences of professional politics, now his words carry genuine emotion that makes everyone in the Senate chamber distinctly uncomfortable. Romans prefer their politicians to be predictably corrupt rather than unpredictably sincere, because corruption can be negotiated with while sincerity tends to be dangerously inflexible. The dinner party invitations that once flowed to Scribonius like water now slow to a cautious trickle, because hosting a senator who might derail your carefully planned evening with inappropriate emotional displays represents exactly the kind of social risk that Roman elites spend their lives avoiding. You watch him, sitting alone at events where he was once surrounded by admirers and supplicants, and the isolation seems to feed his obsession rather than cure it. What makes this political suicide even more fascinating is that Scribonius appears to be completely aware of what he's doing to himself. You see moments of clarity where he recognises how his behaviour is being perceived, where he understands the long-term consequences of abandoning the political game that gave his life meaning and structure. But understanding the problem and being able to solve it turn out to be entirely different things, especially when the problem involves emotions that operate according to their own logic. The other senators begin treating him with the careful politeness reserved for dangerous animals or unstable relatives. They're not ready to abandon him entirely. His wealth and connections still carry significant weight. But they're also not willing to tie their own fortunes to someone who seems determined to throw his career away for reasons nobody can quite comprehend. It's like watching a controlled demolition, where everyone can see the building's going to fall, but nobody knows exactly when or which direction it will topple. You realise you're witnessing something that Roman society wasn't designed to handle. A powerful man choosing personal happiness over public duty, individual authenticity over collective expectations. In a civilization built on the assumption that ambitious people will always prioritise their careers over their emotions, Scribonius has become a walking contradiction that threatens to expose the fundamental hollowness of everything Rome claims to value. His political suicide isn't just personal destruction. It's a challenge to the entire system that made him who he is. You find yourself buried in the dusty archives beneath the Forum, surrounded by papyrus scrolls and wax tablets that contain the cold, brutal mathematics of human freedom. Tonight you'll discover that in ancient Rome, liberation wasn't a gift or an act of kindness. It was a business transaction with prices so specific they were recorded down to the last copper coin, and the cost of freeing someone you love could bankrupt your soul in more ways than one. The official documents spread before you read like a macabre shopping list, each line item representing someone's entire existence reduced to market value. A skilled household slave, 50,000 denarii. A trained scribe who speaks 3 languages, 75,000. A musician with exceptional talent and proven crowd appeal. The price becomes negotiable, but the starting bid would make modern lottery winners feel poor. You're looking at a system that turned human liberation into just another luxury purchase, available to anyone wealthy enough to afford the asking price. Scribonius could technically afford to free Lycaon without even noticing the financial impact. That's how obscenely rich he is. But Roman law, with its typical genius for making simple things impossibly complicated, doesn't allow masters to simply declare their slaves free and call it a day. The paperwork alone requires months of legal preparation, multiple witnesses, formal declarations before magistrates, and fees that seem designed to discourage anyone from actually completing the process. You discover that manumission, the formal process of freeing a slave, comes in 3 distinct flavours, each with its own legal implications and social consequences. There's manumission by will, which only takes effect after the master dies, making it essentially a posthumous gift that costs the dead person nothing. There's manumission by census, which requires travelling to Rome every 5 years, when the census is conducted, and making a formal declaration before government officials, who may or may not be available when you need them. And then there's manumission by rod, a ceremony so bizarre it seems designed by people who enjoyed making important things unnecessarily theatrical. The manumission by rod requires the slave owner to appear before a praetor with the slave in question, while a random citizen called a lictor touches the slave with a ceremonial rod and declares them free. It sounds simple until you realise that finding an available praetor, scheduling the ceremony, arranging for witnesses, and coordinating all the participants can take longer than planning a military campaign. Romans apparently believed that if you're going to free a human being, you should have to work for it. Historians still argue whether these complicated procedures were designed to protect slaves from impulsive masters or to protect masters from impulsive generosity. But the practical effect was to make manumission rare enough that freed slaves remained special rather than common. You see, if freeing slaves became too easy, the entire economic foundation of Roman society would collapse faster than a poorly built amphitheatre. The system needed to allow just enough freedom to maintain the illusion of possibility, while keeping the reality difficult enough to preserve the status quo. But here's where the mathematics get really twisted. Even after paying for freedom, even after completing all the legal requirements, even after jumping through every procedural hoop Roman law could devise, the newly freed slave doesn't actually become free in any way that makes sense to modern thinking. They become a libertus, a freed slave who remains legally bound to their former master for life, obligated to provide services, show respect, and generally continue acting like property that happens to have slightly better paperwork. The financial records reveal something even more disturbing. Many masters used the promise of eventual freedom as a management tool, dangling liberation like a carrot to ensure good behaviour and maximum productivity from their human property. Some slaves spent decades earning the money to purchase their own freedom, only to discover that their master had been investing those payments and would return the full amount as a generous gift, while simultaneously denying the manumission request. It's the kind of psychological manipulation that would make modern corporate executives take notes. You notice how the accounting scrolls treat freed slaves differently in their financial projections. A slave represents a capital asset that can be depreciated over time, but a libertus becomes something like an employee with a lifetime contract who can never quit and never demand better terms. From a purely economic standpoint, manumission often represented a clever way to maintain all the benefits of slave ownership while reducing the legal liability and moral discomfort. The cost calculations for freeing Lycaon fill several scrolls because his exceptional musical talents make him a uniquely valuable asset that requires special consideration. The accountants have calculated not just his current market value, but his projected earnings over the next 20 years, his replacement cost, the impact on the household's social status, and even the potential loss of dinner party invitations if he's no longer available to entertain guests. They've turned human liberation into a complex financial analysis that would challenge modern investment bankers. What makes these numbers especially heartbreaking is their clinical precision. You're looking at documents that reduce a person's entire existence to profit margins and opportunity costs, that treat love and freedom as line items in a budget proposal. This is what happens when a civilization becomes so comfortable with owning people that it develops advanced mathematics to optimize the process, creating a bureaucracy of bondage so sophisticated that it could calculate the exact price of a human soul and offer financing options. You step into the shadowy corridors where Roman politics reveals its true nature, a blood sport disguised as governance, where every weakness becomes ammunition and every scandal becomes a weapon in the hands of people who've spent lifetimes learning how to destroy their rivals with surgical precision. Tonight you'll watch as Scribonius's enemies circle closer, their knives sharpened by years of patience, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to present itself. Senator Marcus Cato the Younger emerges as the primary architect of Scribonius's destruction, though he'd be offended by the suggestion that personal malice motivates his actions. Cato represents old Roman values, with the kind of rigid intensity that makes religious fundamentalists look flexible, and he genuinely believes that senators who prioritise personal desires over public duty represent an existential threat to the Republic. You're watching a man who would crucify his own mother if she violated his moral code, approaching the Scribonius situation with the methodical enthusiasm of someone who's finally found a worthy target for his righteous anger. The beauty of Cato's strategy lies in its apparent reasonableness. He doesn't need to prove that Scribonius has done anything explicitly illegal. He only needs to demonstrate that the senator's behaviour has become incompatible with Roman dignity and public service. It's character assassination disguised as civic responsibility, and it's so elegant that even Scribonius's supporters find themselves nodding along with arguments that will ultimately destroy their ally. You drift through private meetings where Cato builds his coalition with the patience of a master craftsman assembling a siege engine. Each conversation is carefully calibrated to appeal to his audience's specific concerns. Military commanders hear about the dangers of emotional instability in leadership positions. Wealthy merchants learn about the economic implications of unpredictable political behaviour. And religious officials receive detailed explanations of how inappropriate relationships between masters and slaves violate sacred Roman traditions. The whisper campaign that began in bathhouses and dinner parties now transforms into something far more dangerous: formal, political opposition with institutional backing. Cato has convinced several influential senators that Scribonius represents a symptom of moral decay that threatens the entire senatorial class. If one senator can abandon his duties for personal obsessions, what prevents others from following suit? The argument resonates because it contains just enough truth to be terrifying, and just enough exaggeration to be actionable. Historians still argue whether Cato genuinely believed Scribonius posed a threat to Roman values, or whether he simply recognised an opportunity to eliminate a political rival. But the distinction becomes meaningless once the machinery of destruction begins operating. You see, Roman politics doesn't distinguish between personal vendettas and principled opposition. Both use the same tools and produce the same results. The only difference lies in how well the perpetrators sleep at night. Senator Publius Clodius approaches the situation from an entirely different angle because his particular brand of political warfare involves appealing directly to Rome's masses rather than working through official channels. Clodius understands that ordinary Romans love nothing more than watching wealthy elites embarrass themselves publicly, and he's prepared to turn Scribonius's personal crisis into popular entertainment that advances his own political agenda. You're watching someone who could teach modern tabloid journalists advanced techniques for monetizing other people's misery. The coordination between Scribonius's enemies becomes visible in the timing of their attacks. Cato handles the moral outrage and institutional pressure, while Clodius manages public opinion and street-level agitation. Other senators contribute specialised expertise. Legal scholars identify potential procedural violations, financial experts examine accounting irregularities, and military veterans question whether someone so emotionally compromised can be trusted with sensitive state information. You notice how they've learned to weaponise Scribonius's own behaviour against him. Every missed vote becomes evidence of dereliction of duty. Every distracted moment gets reframed as contempt for senatorial dignity, and every sign of genuine emotion transforms into proof of mental instability. They're not lying about his actions. They're simply interpreting those actions in the most damaging possible light and presenting their interpretations as objective truth. The most insidious aspect of this campaign is how it forces Scribonius's remaining allies to choose between defending him and protecting themselves. Supporting a senator accused of moral corruption carries significant political risk, especially when that support might be interpreted as endorsement of the alleged behaviour. One by one, his former friends begin distancing themselves through carefully neutral statements that sound supportive, but offer no actual protection. The enemy's strategy reveals the fundamental weakness in Scribonius's position. He's trying to defend behaviour that he can't fully explain without admitting to emotions that Roman society considers inappropriate for someone in his position. He can't deny his attachment to Lycaon because it's obviously genuine, but he can't acknowledge it openly because doing so would validate his opponent's accusations. It's a perfect trap that makes any response look either dishonest or incriminating. You realise you're witnessing the Roman political system operating exactly as designed, identifying and eliminating members who deviate from accepted norms, regardless of whether that deviation represents genuine corruption or simply inconvenient humanity. The vultures aren't circling because they're evil. They're circling because this is what vultures do, and Scribonius has made himself look like something that might be dead soon enough to make the wait worthwhile. You slip through the hidden passages of Scribonius's villa, where architecture becomes conspiracy, and every carefully planned space reveals secrets that could topple governments. Tonight you'll explore the physical manifestation of a forbidden love affair, discovering how wealthy Romans turned their homes into elaborate stage sets for emotions that society demanded remain invisible to the outside world. The villa's public areas gleam with the kind of ostentatious display that announces wealth and power to anyone who enters. Marble imported from quarries that supplied imperial palaces, frescoes painted by artists whose names appear in history books, and sculpture collections that would make modern museums bankrupt themselves trying to acquire them. But you're not here for the public spaces. You're here to see what Scribonius built when he thought nobody was watching. The rooms that exist solely to house a love that dare not speak its name in Roman daylight. Behind the kitchen, accessible only through a passage disguised as a storage area for olive oil amphoras, you discover rooms that don't appear on any architectural plans. The craftsmanship here matches the villa's public areas, but the purpose is entirely different. These spaces weren't designed to impress visitors or display social status. They were created as a refuge from the expectations and judgments of Roman society, a place where a senator and his slave could exist as simply two people who happened to care about each other. The first hidden chamber serves as Lycaon's private music room, but calling it merely a practice space would be like calling the Pantheon merely a building. You see instruments arranged with the reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, lyres with strings that cost more than most Romans earn in a year, flutes carved from ivory by craftsmen whose techniques died with ancient kingdoms, and percussion instruments that produce sounds so pure they seem to reshape the air around them. This isn't just a room where someone practices music. It's a shrine to artistic perfection that happens to be hidden behind false walls. The acoustic engineering would impress modern sound designers. The walls are covered with specially woven tapestries that absorb and reflect sound in ways that enhance Lycaon's voice, while preventing it from carrying to other parts of the villa. The ceiling height has been calculated to create optimal resonance, and small alcoves around the room are positioned to amplify specific frequencies. Scribonius has essentially built a concert hall for an audience of one, using architectural principles that wouldn't be fully understood again until centuries after Rome fell. You discover a second hidden room that serves as a library, but not the kind of collection Roman senators usually maintain for public display. These scrolls contain poetry that would make moral guardians faint with outrage, love letters written in languages that most Romans can't read, philosophical treatises on relationships that challenge every assumption their society holds sacred, and literary works that explore themes of equality and emotional authenticity that won't become mainstream for another 2,000 years. Historians still argue whether these texts were commissioned specifically for this collection, or whether Scribonius spent years secretly acquiring writings that reflected his increasingly heretical views on love and human dignity. But either explanation reveals someone who's been thinking about these forbidden topics far longer than his recent behaviour might suggest. You're looking at evidence of a philosophical revolution that began long before it became visible in his political actions. The most shocking discovery lies behind a bookshelf that rotates on hidden hinges, a room that's been furnished as a private dining area where two people can share meals without the elaborate hierarchy that governs every other aspect of Roman domestic life. The chairs are the same height, the table settings are identical, and there are no visible symbols of rank or status difference. In a society where every meal reinforces social hierarchies through seating arrangements and service protocols, this represents nothing short of revolutionary architecture. The wine stored in this hidden cellar comes from vineyards that produce exclusively for imperial tables, bottles that most senators have never tasted despite their wealth and connections. But here, in secret, Scribonius shares drinks that emperors consider special with someone who legally owns nothing, not even his own freedom. You're looking at luxury used not to display superiority, but to express equality, which might be the most subversive thing wealth has ever accomplished. You notice how the hidden rooms connect through passages that bypass the villa's main corridors entirely. Someone could move between these spaces without ever entering areas where household staff might observe their activities. The privacy isn't just about concealment, it's about creating a separate world where Roman social rules don't apply, where two people can interact according to principles that their civilization refuses to acknowledge as valid. The construction details reveal how long this project has been developing. The hidden passages show wear patterns that suggest years of regular use. The secret rooms contain furniture that's been replaced and upgraded multiple times, and the overall design demonstrates a level of planning that only makes sense if you understand this as a long-term commitment rather than a recent infatuation. Scribonius hasn't just fallen in love. He's been building a parallel universe where that love can exist safely. What makes these discoveries especially poignant is their inevitable impermanence. You're looking at rooms that exist only as long as their secret remains protected, spaces that will be sealed or destroyed the moment Roman society discovers their purpose. This villa within a villa represents the physical embodiment of a relationship that can only survive in hiding, beautiful and elaborate and completely doomed by the civilization that made both its creation and its destruction inevitable. You step into the heart of Roman political theatre, where democracy reveals its most terrifying characteristic: the ability to transform personal scandals into constitutional crises that threaten the stability of entire civilizations. Tonight you'll witness the Senate floor become a battlefield where Scribonius's private choices collide with public expectations, creating the kind of spectacle that makes emperors nervous and historians rich with material for centuries of academic debate. The session begins with deceptive normalcy, senators filing into their assigned seats with the practiced dignity of men who've spent lifetimes perfecting the art of looking important while accomplishing very little. You watch Scribonius enter the chamber and immediately sense the shift in atmosphere. Conversations halt mid-sentence. Casual greetings become formally polite, and the usual pre-session socialising takes on the careful tension of people trying not to stare at a man they expect to combust at any moment. Cato rises to address what he carefully terms a matter of senatorial propriety that affects the dignity of this body and the moral foundation of our republic. His voice carries the righteous certainty of someone who's never doubted the correctness of his own opinions, and you realise you're about to hear character assassination elevated to the level of high art. He doesn't mention Scribonius by name initially. He doesn't need to, because everyone in the chamber knows exactly which senator's behaviour has prompted this suddenly urgent concern for Roman values. The speech that follows represents a masterclass in political rhetoric, designed to destroy someone without actually accusing them of anything specific. Cato speaks eloquently about the sacred duty senators owe to the people, the importance of setting moral examples for Roman society, and the dangers of allowing personal desires to compromise public service. Every word could apply to any number of situations, but the timing and context make the target unmistakably clear. You watch Scribonius's face during this performance and see something that's both heartbreaking and terrifying. A man who realises he's being publicly executed, but can't figure out how to defend himself without making things worse. He can't deny his attachment to Lycaeum because it's genuine, but he can't acknowledge it because doing so would validate every accusation his enemies are making. It's a perfect trap that transforms honesty into weakness and silence into admission of guilt. Historians still argue whether what happened next represents one of the greatest speeches in Roman history or one of the most spectacular political suicides ever recorded. But either way, Scribonius's response changes everything. Instead of offering the expected denial or deflection, he stands and delivers what amounts to a philosophical treatise on love, human dignity, and the arbitrary nature of social hierarchies that happen to be enforced by the very institution he's addressing. "Honoured colleagues," he begins, and you can hear in his voice the moment when someone decides that truth matters more than survival. We speak often of Roman values, but we rarely examine whether those values serve Rome or whether Rome has become enslaved to values that diminish our humanity. The silence that follows this opening suggests that everyone in the chamber understands they're witnessing something unprecedented and possibly catastrophic. The speech that unfolds challenges every assumption Roman society takes for granted about slavery, citizenship, social hierarchy, and the relationship between personal happiness and public duty. Scribonius argues that a civilization that requires its leaders to choose between authentic human connection and political effectiveness has created a system that corrupts both love and governance. You're listening to ideas that won't become mainstream for centuries, delivered by a man who knows they'll probably destroy him. The most dangerous moment comes when Scribonius addresses the relationship directly. If caring deeply about another human being disqualifies someone from public service, then we've created a government by and for people incapable of the very emotions that make governance worthwhile. The chamber erupts in voices that range from supportive murmurs to outraged shouting, and you realise you're watching the Roman Senate experience something approaching collective, nervous breakdown. Clodius seizes the opportunity to escalate the crisis by demanding an immediate vote of censure, claiming that Scribonius's speech itself demonstrates unfitness for office. Other senators begin choosing sides based on calculations that have nothing to do with the actual issues involved. Some see an opportunity to align themselves with moral authority. Others recognise a chance to eliminate a political rival, and a few genuinely struggle with questions about the relationship between personal integrity and public service. You notice how the debate reveals fractures within Roman society that extend far beyond one senator's personal life. Younger senators seem more sympathetic to Scribonius's arguments, while older members react with the horror of people watching their entire worldview under assault. regional differences emerge as representatives from newer provinces appear less committed to traditional Roman hierarchies than senators from established families in the Italian heartland. The session stretches past sunset as speaker after speaker uses Scribonius' situation to advance their own political agendas or settle old scores. What began as a moral crisis has transformed into a comprehensive examination of Roman values, social structures, and the limits of acceptable behaviour for political leaders. You're watching democracy process a challenge it wasn't designed to handle, the possibility that one of its fundamental assumptions might be wrong. The evening concludes without resolution, but the battle lines have been drawn in ways that will reshape Roman politics for generations. Some senators will never forgive Scribonius for forcing them to confront uncomfortable questions about their own complicity in systems they've never examined. Others will remember this as the day someone finally spoke truths that needed speaking, regardless of the personal cost. And everyone will understand that the Republic has been changed by witnessing authentic human emotion collide with institutional expectations in the most public forum possible. You find yourself in the flickering candlelight of Scribonius' private study, surrounded by correspondence that reads like love letters written in blood. Not metaphorically, but literally, because when Roman senators decide to gamble everything on impossible dreams, they tend to do it with the kind of dramatic flair that would make theatre directors weep with professional envy. Tonight you'll discover how desperate love transforms careful political calculation into revolutionary manifestos that threaten to burn down the world. The first letter lies open on his desk, its wax seal broken with trembling fingers, and you realise you're looking at something that could be either a suicide note or a declaration of independence from everything Roman civilization holds sacred. Scribonius' handwriting, usually precise and controlled like everything else about his public persona, has devolved into the frantic scrawl of someone writing faster than his thoughts can organise themselves. The ink occasionally splatters where his hand shook, creating abstract patterns that look disturbingly like bloodstains. "My dearest Lycaon," the letter begins, and immediately you understand why this correspondence could never be allowed to become public. Roman senators simply don't address slaves as dearest anything, and they certainly don't begin personal letters with language that suggests emotional equality between master and property. You're reading words that violate fundamental assumptions about hierarchy and human value that Roman society uses to justify its entire existence. The letters reveal a progression of increasingly radical thinking that charts Scribonius' philosophical journey from conventional Roman values to ideas that won't become socially acceptable for another 2,000 years. Early correspondence focuses on practical matters, arrangements for music lessons, discussions of household management, requests for specific songs to be prepared for dinner parties. But gradually, the tone shifts from master instructing property to one human being sharing thoughts with another human being, who happens to be legally owned by the first. You discover drafts of letters that were never sent, crossed out passages that reveal how carefully Scribonius has been editing his own emotions to make them acceptable for Roman consumption. Deleted sentences contain admissions of genuine affection, philosophical observations about the arbitrariness of social hierarchies, and increasingly bold statements about human dignity that transcend legal classifications. You're watching someone slowly convince himself that his feelings are more important than his civilization's approval. Historians still argue whether these letters represent authentic, emotional evolution or carefully calculated political theatre designed to justify behaviour that Scribonius had already decided to pursue. But the physical evidence suggests genuine psychological transformation. The handwriting changes over time, becoming more confident and less apologetic. The vocabulary shifts from formal Latin, appropriate for master-slave communication, to intimate language that assumes emotional reciprocity between equals. The most dangerous letters contain explicit criticism of Roman slavery that reads like revolutionary propaganda disguised as personal reflection. Scribonius questions whether a society that treats human beings as property can legitimately claim moral authority over anything, whether legal classifications that ignore emotional reality serve any purpose except protecting the comfort of people who benefit from systematic injustice, and whether personal happiness might be more important than the social stability. You find carbon copies of correspondence with legal scholars, philosophers, and foreign intellectuals who've been helping Scribonius research precedents for challenging Roman slavery through official channels. The responses reveal a network of people who've been thinking about these issues far longer than his recent behaviour might suggest. Some letters contain detailed legal strategies for using existing Roman law to expand definitions of human dignity, while others propose entirely new philosophical frameworks that would eliminate slavery altogether. The financial correspondence proves equally revealing, showing calculations for purchasing not just Lycaon's freedom, but liberation for the senator's entire household staff. The numbers are staggering, enough money to fund a small military campaign. But Scribonius appears willing to liquidate significant portions of his wealth to transform his personal crisis into a broader statement about human dignity. You're looking at someone who's decided that being right matters more than being rich. The most shocking discovery comes in a letter addressed to no one in particular, apparently written as a way of organising his thoughts before making final decisions that will determine the rest of his life. Here, Scribonius admits that he's been planning this confrontation with Roman society for months, deliberately creating situations that would force public examination of issues he believes too important to remain hidden in private spaces. You realise that what looked like impulsive behaviour driven by uncontrollable emotion was actually a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to use his personal situation as a catalyst for broader social change. Scribonius hasn't lost control. He's gained clarity about what kind of person he wants to be and what kind of society he wants to live in, even if achieving those goals requires destroying everything he's spent his life building. The final letter, sealed but not yet sent, contains instructions for Lycaon that reveal the true scope of Scribonius' planning. Detailed escape routes, financial resources hidden in secure locations, contacts in distant provinces who've agreed to provide sanctuary, and legal documents that will take effect regardless of what happens to the senator himself. You're looking at a backup plan that ensures the person he loves will survive, even if the revolution he's starting destroys him. The correspondence reveals someone who's moved beyond hoping for society's approval to actively working for society's transformation, using his wealth and position and reputation as weapons against the very system that gave him those advantages. It's either the most elaborate suicide note in human history, or the opening salvo in a war that will reshape how civilizations think about human dignity. The blood-red wax seals suggest Scribonius has already decided which interpretation he prefers. You stand in the marble corridors where the entire Roman Empire seems to be holding its breath, waiting to see whether one senator's personal revolution will ignite something larger or simply burn itself out in spectacular fashion. Tonight you'll witness how individual acts of defiance can paralyze entire civilizations, creating moments when the future hangs suspended between what has always been and what might become possible if someone proves brave enough to imagine it. The news of Scribonius' Senate speech has spread beyond Rome's political circles into the broader population, creating ripple effects that nobody anticipated and few people know how to manage. You hear conversations in markets and bathhouses where ordinary citizens debate questions that were previously reserved for philosophers and legal scholars. What makes someone truly free? Can love exist between people of different social classes? Should personal happiness ever outweigh social duty? These aren't the kinds of topics that usually interest people worried about grain prices and tax collection. Slave households throughout the empire have begun experiencing unusual tensions as news of the senator's behaviour spreads through networks that move information faster than official government communications. You notice how household servants exchange glances that carry new meaning, how conversations halt when masters enter rooms, and how the usual rhythms of domestic life have acquired an underlying current of anticipation that makes everyone nervous. Some slaves are hoping for liberation, others fear the backlash if expectations aren't met, and most are simply confused about whether they should celebrate or hide. The foreign embassies in Rome have been sending increasingly urgent dispatches to their home governments, trying to explain a political crisis that seems to involve intimate relationships rather than military threats or economic policies. You read reports from Egyptian ambassadors who describe Roman senators debating the fundamental nature of human dignity as if it were a routine budget discussion, and correspondence from Greek diplomats who express professional admiration for political theatre. that surpasses anything their own civilization ever produced. Historians still argue whether this moment represents the beginning of significant social change or merely a temporary disruption that will be absorbed by Roman society's remarkable ability to accommodate scandal without actually changing anything fundamental, but the immediate effects are undeniable. Military commanders are requesting clarification about whether existing orders regarding slave management remain in effect. Provincial governors are asking for guidance about handling local situations involving masters and slaves. And tax collectors are reporting unusual difficulty in conducting routine business. The religious establishment has responded with characteristic institutional panic, producing emergency proclamations that attempt to address the spiritual implications of Scribonius's challenge to Roman social hierarchy. You see priests frantically consulting ancient texts for precedents that might help them determine whether genuine love between people of different social classes represents divine blessing or spiritual corruption. The fact that they're taking the question seriously suggests how profoundly the senators' actions have disrupted normal assumptions about morality and social order. Emperor Nero himself has begun receiving daily briefings about a situation that started as private gossip and has somehow evolved into a potential threat to imperial stability. The reports you glimpse reveal an emperor who's simultaneously fascinated by the drama and terrified by its implications. If senators can abandon their duties for personal relationships, what prevents other government officials from following suit? If traditional social hierarchies can be questioned openly, what happens to the entire system of authority that keeps the empire functioning? You notice how different social classes have responded to the crisis in ways that reveal their own underlying anxieties and aspirations. Wealthy merchants worry that challenging slavery might disrupt labour systems their businesses depend on, while successful freedmen fear that expanding definitions of human dignity might diminish the special status they've worked to achieve. Military veterans express concern that emotional decision-making might spread to commanders responsible for battlefield leadership, potentially compromising imperial defence. The most unexpected reaction comes from Rome's intellectual community, where philosophers and writers who've spent careers discussing abstract concepts of justice and human dignity suddenly find themselves confronting the practical implications of their theoretical work. Some embrace Scribonius as a hero who's finally applied philosophical principles to real-world situations, while others retreat into academic safety by arguing that individual cases shouldn't be used to challenge established social structures. Women throughout Roman society have begun discussing the crisis in ways that reveal how closely they identify with anyone whose personal choices are constrained by social expectations about appropriate behaviour. You hear conversations where senators' wives debate whether emotional authenticity should ever take precedence over family duty, and exchanges between mothers and daughters that explore questions about choosing personal happiness over social acceptance. The parallels between Scribonius's situation and their own constraints aren't lost on anyone. The economic implications have started affecting markets in ways that demonstrate how deeply personal relationships intertwine with broader social systems. Slave prices have become volatile as buyers and sellers try to anticipate whether legal changes might affect their investments, while the luxury goods market experiences unusual activity as wealthy families reconsider purchases that depend on slave labour. You're watching how individual conscience can accidentally become economic policy. Foreign observers have begun arriving in Rome to witness what they're describing as either the collapse of an empire or the birth of a new form of civilization. Scholars from Greece, Egypt and Gaul are recording everything they see, recognizing that they might be documenting a historical pivot point that will influence how future societies organize themselves. Some are hoping Roman society will demonstrate that established civilizations can evolve without destroying themselves, while others are betting that the contradictions will prove insurmountable. The strangest aspect of this suspended moment is how ordinary life continues alongside extraordinary uncertainty. Markets still operate, government offices still function, and people still worry about routine problems while simultaneously participating in debates that could reshape human civilization. You're witnessing how historical transformation actually happens. Not through sudden dramatic changes, but through gradual shifts in what people are willing to accept as normal, inevitable, or unchangeable. You're standing in the courtroom, not metaphorically, literally, because even in dreams, Rome knows how to make a scene. The forum is packed with bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, all pretending to care about law when what they're really here for is the drama. You can practically smell the gossip. Perfume, sweat, old wine breath, and curiosity. The true fragrance of Roman justice. And at the centre of it all, the senator. Marcus sits straight, eyes hollow. His face looks like it was carved from exhausted marble. Across from him, his former colleagues, now his accusers, present their case with the flair of theatre critics rather than legal minds. This isn't a trial, it's a stage, and the script has already been written by society's expectations. His crime, loving a slave. Well, technically, violating senatorial decorum, undermining Roman virtue, destabilising the hierarchy, abusing his office, and about 9 other things that boil down to the same whispered accusation. He cared too much for someone he wasn't supposed to. Historians still argue whether this trial was truly about law or whether it was all performance. Some scrolls emphasise procedural integrity. Others claim the final verdict was decided before Marcus ever opened his mouth. As always, Rome pretended to follow rules, while sharpening its knives behind the curtain. And let's talk about those rules for a second. Roman law, especially in the late Republic, had this shiny outer layer. Orderly, structured, beautifully logical. But peel it back and you'll find a rotting core of power games, grudges, and performative outrage. It's like judging someone for stealing bread while ignoring the starving child they're feeding. And yet, Marcus chooses to speak. You lean in as he rises slowly, the courtroom holding its collective breath. His voice, hoarse but steady, begins not with excuses but with a name. The slave's name. The very one that's been avoided, scrubbed from scrolls, tiptoed around by senators and servants alike. He says it like a vow. And in that moment you feel the shift. Not in the room. The people still hate him. But in the air, like history itself pauses, eyes wide. Remember that voice that once stopped traffic on a Roman street? It's back now, Sutton. Not booming, but cutting through silence like a dagger. He talks about loyalty, about kindness shown in secret, about nights spent not in lust, but in learning each other's languages. The way you do when you've fallen, recklessly, without armour. He doesn't cry because Romans don't cry, but his voice breaks just once, and that's enough to start a wave of clenched jaws across the room. Of course, his defence doesn't land. The prosecution, smelling blood, pivots hard. They drag out witnesses, slaves bribed to tell stories, scrolls with shaky handwriting suggesting treasonous plans. One senator, eager for applause, declares Marcus not just a fool, but a threat to Roman foundations. You'd think he'd murdered a Vestal virgin. Here's the funny bit though. While they paint Marcus as deranged, they also sort of admire him. That's Rome for you. Deep down it respects courage, even when it wants to crucify it. Still, the question on everyone's lips, what happens now? You already know Rome doesn't do second chances. Redemption isn't a thing here. You either fall on your sword or get nudged toward it by polite society. Exile is floated, a clean solution. But execution buzzes louder like a fly that won't leave the fruit bowl. After all, mercy might be interpreted as weakness. But then something strange happens. A younger senator, barely 30, toga too crisp, probably still smells like olive oil shampoo, stands up and makes a plea. Not for Marcus, but for the institution. He warns that Rome must be careful not to turn passion into persecution. That the real threat is not love, but hypocrisy. It's not a mic drop moment. Rome doesn't do those either. But it causes murmuring. And Marcus, who looked ready to vanish, lifts his eyes again. Historians still debate this turning point. Was the younger senator genuine? Was he secretly Marcus's former student? Was he planting seeds for his own rise to power? Nobody knows. All we have are fragments of speeches, and one strange letter that mentions the senator who dared to love. Ultimately, the trial ends not with a verdict shouted, but with one whispered behind doors. You never hear the official sentence, but you do hear footsteps that night. A rustle of guards, a chariot that rolls out under moonlight, heading somewhere distant, quiet and cold. And the slave? You'll find out soon. But for now you picture Marcus disappearing into the hills outside Rome. His legacy tarnished, his estate seized, his name scrubbed from most monuments. But his story, that stayed. Because even when Rome tries to bury a scandal, it never quite stays buried. Still listening? If you're enjoying this story, whisper subscribe to The Shadows. Or just click the button. You wake. Not suddenly, but with that slow drifting realization that you've followed Marcus. Not in body, no, but in thought, in spirit, in curiosity. And now you're with him on the edge of the known world. The Appian Way stretches ahead, lined with tombs and cypress trees like silent spectators. It's the road every Roman knows, the spine of empire, the path of heroes, generals, slaves and senators. But tonight it's quiet. Too quiet. Even the wheels of the chariot seem ashamed to creak. Marcus sits cloaked, not in silk but in coarse wool. His eyes never meet the horizon. Because he's not looking forward. He's thinking backward, replaying every moment, every risk, every whispered word exchanged in the dim corridors of his villa. And beside him, the slave. Yes, they're still together. That part survived the courtroom. Rome might have banished Marcus, stripped him of titles, lands and honour, but it did not pry him from the one he refused to call property. That's the twist that still makes historians raise eyebrows. No record of forced separation. No sale to a harsher master. Somehow, miraculously, maybe politically, Marcus kept the one thing that truly mattered. Some say he blackmailed a fellow senator with old scrolls. Others claim a bribe. A few dreamier historians like to believe the courts turned a blind eye. Just this once. They travel in silence for days, ducking into roadside taverns, feeding on stale bread and borrowed olives. No servants now, no silk sheets. Just them and a bond no law could unravel. And then, just outside a fishing village near Brundisium, they stop. The villa is small, nothing like the marble and gold monstrosity Marcus once owned, but it's private, shaded by vines and smells of salt and rosemary. For the first time, you hear laughter again. Not from Marcus. Not yet, but from the one he loved. The sound is hesitant, like a bird testing new wings, but it's real, and it makes something shift in your chest. They plant things, not just herbs and fig trees, but humillement. But roots, habits, routines, a life. You watch Marcus learn how to patch sandals and cure fish. The slave, now free, though neither of them says it aloud, teaches him songs from their homeland, words that twist Marcus's Roman tongue into unfamiliar, softer shapes. It's not a perfect life. Sometimes Marcus still wakes in cold sweat, whispering Senate debates under his breath. Sometimes they argue about the past, about guilt, about how much was worth it. But they always return to each other. Not with grand declarations, but quiet things. Boiling lentils, braiding vines. Sitting shoulder to shoulder in warm silence. And here's where things get interesting. Because someone couldn't leave well enough alone. One scroll survives from this period, written by a travelling scholar who visited their villa by accident. Lost, hungry, expecting a cold bed and grumpy host. Instead he found a fallen lion with farmer's hands, and a companion whose presence turned silence into music. That line, copied, quoted, misquoted, turned into poetry and legend, the love story of Marcus the exiled and his unnamed companion. Still, not everyone believed it. Some accused the scroll of romantic exaggeration. Others insisted the story was real but the love wasn't. Affection maybe, dependency sure, but not love, they claimed, as if they knew. As if love had to fit some Roman template. Letters, lineage, legacy. But you see it in the details. The way Marcus pauses before every meal, waiting for the other to sit first. The way he still uses formal titles, out of respect, not habit. The way they mark the anniversary of the trial with wine and silence instead of sorrow. That's not performance, that's partnership. Years pass. Rome changes. Emperors rise and fall. New laws sweep over old ones like waves erasing footprints. But here in this forgotten villa the world slows. And eventually stops. Marcus dies first. Peacefully. Quietly with salt in his beard and one hand resting over the others. And in a rare moment of defiance, the former slave, now fully free, carves his name next to Marcus's on a shared gravestone. That act alone breaks every Roman burial rule. No patrician would allow it. But out here, no one's watching. Or maybe, no one's stopping them anymore. Over time, the tombstone wears down. Ivy creeps over it. Earth shifts. The name Marcus becomes hard to read. But the other name, still there. Historians argue about it constantly. Some say it was fictional, added later by romantic poets. Others insist it's proof of the first recorded same-gender love monument in Roman history. One very angry academic once wrote, "This is not history, it's bedtime propaganda." And maybe it is. Maybe that's what makes it powerful, because whether or not every detail is fact, the feeling, the risk, the courage, the quiet devotion, is real. Real enough to echo down 2,000 years and land in your ears tonight. Can't sleep yet? Next week's story might just top this one. The story should end here. It would be neater, more romantic. A tidy Roman tragedy wrapped in warm coastal air, sealed with a gravestone that time can't quite erase. But Rome never lets go that easily. Because years after Marcus's quiet death and his companion's final stand against erasure, something strange happens. You're in a museum now. Not a grand marble one. A dusty backroom, tucked inside a minor antiquities archive near Naples. And here, beneath a flickering bulb, someone's just opened a crate that hasn't been touched in a century. Inside, letters. Dozens of them. Faded parchment, cracked wax seals. Most are mundane. Receipts, invitations, wine orders from senators with too much free time. But in the middle of the stack, a scroll. One addressed not to a name, but to a voice. It begins, "To the one who sang on the balcony at dawn." You stop breathing. It's Marcus's handwriting. You recognise it from trial records, from his early speeches, even from a few love poems falsely attributed to Catullus. You now know better. But this scroll is different. It's raw. No legal polish, just a man stripped of everything except memory. He writes about the scent of roasted barley in the mornings, about hands rough from pruning vines, about the ache in his back, and how even that became a comfort when shared. He confesses fear, not of exile, but of being forgotten, of their story being swallowed by empire, turned into a footnote. Then he does something bolder. He names his lover. Not with titles, not with metaphors, not with veiled allusions, but plainly, clearly, tenderly. The name you saw on the gravestone is here again, only now surrounded by verbs like waited, trusted, laughed, saved. It's not a list of deeds, it's a liturgy. And right at the end, scrawled smaller than the rest, "If Rome cannot remember us with honour, then let sleep do it instead." You blink, not because your eyes are dry, but because the past just folded itself into the present. You, sitting here listening, resting your head on a soft pillow, are fulfilling Marcus's last wish. Because you remember the young senator who defied the Senate, the love that broke rules but built something stronger, the trial that was more theatre than justice, the villa that smelled of rosemary, the voice that once stopped traffic, the silence that followed. And now you know, their story didn't disappear. It travelled, morphed into myths whispered by sailors, rewritten into lovers' fables sung by troubadours who never knew the source. Eventually it faded into legend, but not completely, because tonight, on this very sleepy evening, under a blanket of tired stars and slow breaths, it found you. You, the one who stayed with the story this long. So let's honour that. Let's stretch out the last moments of this tale like sun-warmed linen on a quiet Roman afternoon. Picture the sea humming softly outside that little villa. Picture vines climbing lazily up stone walls. Picture 2 empty cups on a windowsill, still warm from hands that once held them. Marcus and his beloved are gone, but their echoes remain. In every risky love, every defiant act of tenderness, every story passed between people who were told they couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't. Still listening? If this story reached you, even a little, maybe tap that subscribe. It helps keep these echoes alive. And now the lights are dim. The past has told its secrets. You've wandered through Roman courts, villas and vineyards. You've traced one man's ruin and redemption. And you've carried the memory of a name that Rome tried to forget. You've earned rest now. Let the past hum quietly as you sleep. Your breathing slows. The weight of 2,000 years drifts gently off your shoulders. The marble fades. The dust settles. The scrolls curl inward, like they too are finally ready to sleep. There's no more trial, no more exile, no more whispers behind marble columns. Just you. And a story that somehow reached across centuries to sit quietly beside you in the dark. You don't need to remember every name, every Roman road, every whispered word. Just the feeling, that human pulse beneath the history. The truth that even in the harshest empires, love found small cracks to bloom in, that even in times of chains and cruel laws, someone looked into someone else's eyes and chose to stay. That matters. That's worth sleeping on. So rest now. Let the chariots stop. Let the forum go quiet. Let the voices of senators, slaves, scholars and scribes melt into background hum. You're safe here, wrapped in time, rocked by memory. The Appian Way no longer stretches. It stills. The sea no longer roars. It breathes. And somewhere in the forgotten corners of history, a gravestone whispers thank you. Sleep well, dream curiously and come back soon.